Hey guys. So I've been promising to make some information out available to a couple of my friends, and it took me quite a bit of a while to figure out how to best do this. And in the end, I decided that it's probably best just to give a proper presentation rather than just standing in front of a camera and talking. This presentation was actually made for my personal coaching reasons. However, I just decided why not release this. Okay, so to my friends, I hope this is going to be helpful. Okay. The question was in regards to how to get into KTA, a little bit more of an advanced level, number one, and number two, also about things like how to reach your maximum draw length, what is alignment, and why should we choose one alignment type versus another, right? That kind of stuff. So let's start with kind of the basic question. What is alignment in archery, right? Well, there's a lot of ways to define the term alignment, but as far as kind of the most generic surface level kind of terminology is concerned, when we're dealing with alignment in archery, we basically mean one of two things. Either kind of our body's spatial relationship to the target, right? That's one way to define alignment. But the other way to define alignment is essentially kind of the relationship between the parts of the body with each other, and as well as with the bow and the arrow. Okay, when that happens, what occurs is, as you can see, it kind of forms like a shape. Okay, this shape is something that can be kind of categorized and defined objectively, and as a result of that, what I've noticed over the years in my research is that Korean archery actually has kind of four basic alignment types, and they all revolve around the triangle, and they look something like this. Now, this is not some sort of official terminology. Like, I don't know anybody else in the KTA community who defines it like this, other than folks that I've talked to myself, and they've kind of adopted this. But what I've decided to do for the sake of my own sanity is essentially call this one type 1, this shape type 2, this shape type 3, and this shape type 4. And what you'll notice is all of them form some type of triangle. The triangle is the basis of Korean alignment, okay? And KTA, there's a lot of agreement and there's a lot of disagreement about KTA. If you've ever tried to learn Korean traditional archery, you'll quickly learn that despite all of us using kind of similar terminology, we all mean something sometimes slightly different. Archery is archery, right? There's a bazillion different opinions. But one of the opinions in Korea that for the most part people agree on is that Korean alignment is triangular in nature. The debate comes from which triangle should we be adhering to, okay? So let's analyze these four and talk about kind of pros and cons. First one. This is alignment type 4. Now, I call this one personally like a lightning bolt because a lot of people refer to this triangle and say, well, it's a triangle. And that's true. But the thing that's more noticeable to me is this kind of crookedness. And what I mean by that specifically, whether we're looking at kind of, more modern photos or more historical photos, is this. Do you see how like the bow arm line, right, kind of goes off in this direction? The shoulder blades are squeezed together, so the shoulders kind of form one line, and then the draw arm sort of forms one line like this, okay? Now, because the archer is pulling back the arrow straight, a lot of people who believe in this system say that the triangle is from the draw side shoulder joint to the bow side shoulder joint and through the bow arm to where the bow is, and this is the arrow line, of course, right? Well, I can concede that this is a triangle, and this particular alignment type is probably the most commonly used amongst modern day kind of KTA archers. I personally believe the historical sources, as well as just from my own personal experience shooting high poundage Korean war bows, this system, while it will work, is not good if you're trying to shoot high powered bows especially. But even with lower poundage bows, it's not nearly as stable as it can be. Now, if you shot like this for like, I don't know, 10, 20, 15, like 30 years or whatever, right? Yeah, you can become accurate. But the issue here is that it's it's very weak. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, remember, when you draw back the bow, you're pulling the bow like this, right? There's two issues here. Number one, notice how the force from the bow goes up the bow arm, because archers who do this tend to receive the force. Okay, like they tend to receive the force this way. There's nothing backing the bow arm, so all of that force has to be held by the shoulder, right here, the shoulder joint or the rotator cuff, more specifically the labrum, which is kind of like that soft tissue that's holding the basically the bow arm, the upper arm, the humerus bone into the rotator cuff itself, like right here. So archers who do this, unless they use a very light poundage bow or who have shot like this for a very long time, tend to get fatigued quite quickly. Okay, but there's also a bigger issue. Archers who tend to shoot like this, at least in my experiences, because I used to shoot like this, by the way, guys. I'm not like poo-pooing on something I haven't done before. This is the way I used to shoot when I first learned KTA. But the problem that I kept running into, and I know that a lot of people struggle with this, is forward loosing. Why does that happen? Or plucking. Because at this angle, the draw arm side, like you're trying to pull this way, but the draw arm has reached the limits of its kind of range of motion here, the rotator cuff on the draw side. Because of that, and since the shoulder joint can't really move back any further, the only way the arm can move is outwards and forwards at that point, which tends to result in plucking, which tends to result in forward loosing. So people who shoot like this will sometimes like extend their arm backwards because hinging at the elbow is kind of all you can really do at this point, right? Or they'll try to just release and not let the arm move, okay? And as I stated prior, archers who shoot like this can be accurate, but it does put a lot of strain on the shoulder joints, which is why, you know, if you want to shoot like this, don't let me stop you. But in my personal experiences, this is not the optimal way to shoot, but it does need to be addressed. And, you know, people need to be aware of it because it is so common amongst KT archers. Okay, that's alignment type number 4, what I sometimes call the lightning bolt. Reason why I call it that is because this jagged shape that it forms, like this, kind of reminds me of a lightning bolt shape. So, you know, that's why I call it that. Let's talk about now alignment type number 3, the triangle. Now, what do I mean by the triangle? This triangle is kind of interesting because, again, people who don't like the lightning bolt shape will often switch to this at some point. Now, again, I actually used to shoot like this as well. So after I kind of realized the weaknesses of the lightning bolt shape, I switched to this alignment type. And this is probably the second most common alignment structure amongst KTA archers. And in fact, many good archers shoot like this. Like a lot of Myeonggung shoot like this. It has the benefit that now that the draw side is the line here is a lot cleaner, and also the joint on the draw side here is not rotated to its maximum position, you have sufficient space back here now to have the elbow swing back when you release, which will allow the draw hand to move back cleanly, which tends to result in a much cleaner release. And that's also probably why archers who shoot like this, generally speaking, tend to develop accuracy a lot better than those who used alignment type 4. However, while again, I concede that people who shoot like this are allowed to shoot like that, but as someone who's shooting Korean war bows or researching into that at the moment, I actually realized that just like alignment type 4, because the force of the bow goes off in this direction and there's nothing backing the bow side shoulder joint here, while this works on lighter poundage bows, I've noticed that once you start to get close to about maybe 60 pounds, archers start to struggle unless they intentionally shorten their draw length to reduce the strain upon their shoulder joints. Other than doing that, but I don't want to reduce my draw length to preserve my shoulders. I want to be able to shoot safely while also being able to shoot high poundage bows. For Korean bows that are kind of in the target poundage range, so let's say somewhere from like 15 to 60 pounds, depending on the individual strength of the archer themselves, they're not going to get injured if they shoot like this. But again, it has some pros and cons. Now, I think that the major pro of this style is that it's easy to do. it's not that hard to get into this position. Most people can master this fairly quickly, which is why I think a lot of people start to rely on this. And of course, it being a triangular shape, for those of you who don't know, the triangle is essentially one of the strong, if not the strongest, shape for resisting force. Like, you don't have to believe me on that. Go ask your friends who are architects, who are mechanical engineers. They'll know what I'm talking about, and they'll be able to explain that to you a little bit better. But this triangular shape is incredible for strength, like basically force loading, okay, or bracing against force. However, we have that weakness of the joint here. So as a result of that, some archers believe in alignment type 2. Now, alignment type 2 is very interesting because what we're doing here is forming a straight line, as you can see from these photos, from the bow all the way to the draw side elbow, okay? And this straight line acts as a massive brace against the force of the bow, because you can see how the force now is being, like, instead of like earlier where the arm was kind of crooked like this and the force was going sideways into the joint, you can see how the joint is positioned right in front of the mass of the rib cage. Now, something that I couldn't show with this diagram because this particular skeleton like app thing wouldn't allow me to do it is the expansion of the rib cage. When you breathe, okay, and you can test this to yourself. If you put your hands against your ribs and you go and you inhale and exhale like that, you'll feel your ribs expand and contract, okay? When you're shooting archery, especially with KTA, there's certain ways we need to breathe. Part of the reason for that, though there's many, is when you have the correct amount of air in your lungs, this rib on the left side and the right side too will expand outwards in this direction and fill up any gaps there are between the shoulder blades and the rib itself, so that the arm can genuinely be braced here against the rib cage. This gives so much more structural stability than alignment type 4 or alignment type 3 in comparison. Which is why for those archers, many archers who do shoot this style, they think that this is the optimal way. And again, people are allowed to have their own opinions, so I can concede that. I do 100% agree that this is probably better than alignment type 4 or 3. However, the downside is, of all 4 alignment types, this is probably the hardest one to do well. I usually see a lot of people not be able to get into this position correctly, and they complain about like their draw side shoulder usually getting jammed up, because there is a very specific way that you have to shoot the bow in order for you to be able to do this without getting injured, which is why I think a lot of people tend to default to type 3 because of that difficulty. However, if you can do this, you will find that your control over the bow is way better in comparison to the other alignment type 4 and 3. And also, because of this line being so long, your arm getting so far back, it actually this alignment type number 2 has the longest draw length of the 4 Korean alignment types. So for you kind of draw length junkies out there, if you really want to max out, this is what you got to be doing, okay? Now, with that being said, I actually prefer alignment type number 1. This alignment type also, again, is a triangle, but you can see it forms a brace line here from the draw side shoulder joint through the torso, the bow side shoulder joint, and through the bow arm. So it has the same stability benefits as alignment type number 2. However, because we're not getting this arm like all the way back here, it's a lot easier to achieve this position consistently. And I personally believe that at least the manuscripts that I'm currently studying as part of my research into KTA history, I believe this is the alignment type that was probably most common amongst Korean military archers. I can't prove that definitively, but that's what I personally believe at the moment. Why is this beneficial though, right? Well, because if you can use this structure you can do something that is referred to in the modern day Olympic archery world as transfer to hold. All of the other alignment types, right? Uh, it's difficult to achieve transfer just because of the way that the body has to be structured. But this one makes life very, very easy. You can see how I actually drew arrows like this. There's a reason why. Because with this alignment type, you initiate the drawing of the bow actually by pushing out like this. So you're pushing the bow away from your body, not just with your bow arm, but by using the entire mass of your torso and your bow arm as like a single unit and leaning into the bow itself. As you do that, that creates enough kind of like pressure forward so that the pressure back here gets relieved. It makes it a lot easier then to bring the draw side scapula into the spine and bring the arm around as a single unit without straining the shoulder joint. As a result of that, the string comes back. When you do this properly, you end up in this zone where the pulling force of the bow, as you pull back the string, right, gets redirected into the back and then transferred back into the bow. In the very first video I ever made, I mentioned that the system that I'm currently studying, learning, and sharing with folks is a counterbalancing system. This is what I meant. You are redirecting the force of the bow back into itself so that when done correctly, at full draw, the bow actually resists itself rather than you having to fight it with the force of your muscles, which makes things way easier as far as dealing with high poundage bows are concerned. And even target bows, like it doesn't, you don't have to be shooting war bows to be able to take advantage of this. All of my friends, all of my students who I've ever introduced this to, it took some time for them to be able to do it properly. I've only ever met one individual who was able to do it like within a day. Most people, it takes somewhere between about 3 to 12 months to be able to do this properly. But once they are able to do so, every single one of them have come back to me and said either one of two things. They've either said, one, wow, this is so much better, I'm just going to shoot like this from now on. Or number two, I'm still going to try and dabble with other techniques and other styles and systems. But you know what? I just keep coming back to this one constantly because it just makes my life so much easier. I'm like, yeah, of course. Because again, when you resist the force of the bow with itself, you put a lot less strain on your body. I hear folks tell me things like, up until now, when I used to, like, for example, squeeze my shoulder blades together, I used to feel so much stress on my back and on my neck and my shoulders, but now I almost kind of feel nothing. So when you are able to do transfer to holding properly, or what in Korean we call manjak, that's the effect that will happen. Okay. Now, is this supported in the research? I personally think so, and let's go over that a little bit. But before we do, I want to make one thing kind of clear to you guys. When it comes down to artwork, I always say something that's very important. Historical artwork is neither 100% reliable, nor is it 100% unreliable. I have kind of an issue with people who tend to take extremes there, where they say, oh, the artwork, it's like a perfect photo. Or some people say, no, artwork's just 100% fantasy. And I'm just like, not really, guys. Most of this artwork was done in a period where there was no such thing as the camera. There was no such thing as the photo, right? So unless you know how to analyze artwork properly, like an art historian does, you want to be very careful of making such absolutist statements, okay? The reality is this: as someone who does actually know how to analyze art, who was forced kind of to take 4 art history classes in college, and it was a lot of work, but I might not be like a PhD professor, but I at least on like a professional level know how to analyze art. I know how to research it. I know how to study it, okay? Like I know how to extrapolate out perspective from art. Like for example, do you see how the line here on the seam, like the center seam, okay, of this, basically this hanbok, you see how this side is drawn wider and this side is drawn narrower? This is because the artist here is trying to depict this archer from a 3/4 standpoint. This is basically an attempt to show perspective through foreshortening, okay? And if you don't understand little things like that, little details like that, same thing with like the face, how it, you can see how the nose is right here and there's more distance here and there's less distance here. This is trying to show the face from a 3/4 perspective, because usually, rather than drawing something face on or exactly directly to the side from profile, drawing kind of any object or person or whatever from a 3/4 angle tends to give a more three-dimensional look. So all four of these artists were attempting to show something as much as the artistic convention of the time, the medium that they're using, as well as their skill level would allow. So is it perfect? No. Is it the same thing as a photorealism? Absolutely not. But can we still derive some understanding from the art if we know what we're looking at? Absolutely. And in this case, what we can see here is the four alignment types. You can see how this archer, that triangle, right? From the bow hand to the draw side shoulder, draw side elbow, and through the arm like that, back into the bow. And notice how I didn't draw the line from the arrow. It's actually back into the grip. This is something that we need to talk about one day, about the draw force angle. But for the time being, you can see the triangle. We can see alignment type number 2 here, right? From the bow hand, make a straight line all the way to the elbow, and then the hand comes out like that. And then the line would be completed across here. Alignment type 3, from the bow hand, there's an angle at basically the bow side shoulder joint to here, and we form that triangle this way, and this one's clear. You can see the lightning bolt shape like that. So what I'm trying to show with this is that whether the artist understood archery or not, they at least knew what they were trying to depict, likely because they were basing off of people, of archers that they'd actually seen in real life, right? And so these four alignment types, there's, not definitive, but there is evidence to show that historically, the four Korean alignment types that we see today were also known back then. That's also why before I was showing both modern photos and historical photos from like the early 1900s, just to show you guys that. Also, I want to point out something else. You know how in movies, whenever we see scenes of archery, it's like sometimes it looks kind of jank. Well, one TV series and a movie that's known for their archery, right? This is War of the Arrows, and this is the NBC series Jumong. Both of these actors had to portray characters who were supposed to be master archers. And throughout the series, both of them actually use all four alignment types at some point or another. And that's part of why they look competent, okay? They don't look weird, they don't look janky, because these guys actually did receive some proper training, and I don't know how good they are as individuals, but still, at least they're able to form a triangular alignment. And because of that, they look competent, and they also look Korean. That's another thing I want to point out, is that the four triangular alignment types are not universal, okay? Different cultures, different systems have different alignment shapes. I'm speaking only for Korean archery here. So if you want to look like a Korean, you got to be using some form of triangle as your alignment structure, okay? So that's another little interesting detail. Part of what makes them look good, what makes them look competent, and what makes them actually look like Korean archers. Now, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the historical source material that I'm actually studying. There is I hesitate to call it a manual because it's literally just like a few pages. I personally think it's more of like a cheat sheet, but there is a text known as Haegyeore from, I put circa 1777 here because that's what I understand it to be based off of like the research texts and books that I'm studying, but it's sometime during the 1700s, okay? So there was a man named Lee Chun-gi who was such a good archer that he basically topped out at the military exams multiple times. He received officer promotions multiple times, and in fact, he was even part of the king's bodyguard because he was such a good archer. Okay, and there was a young scholar, who actually asked him how he's so good at archery, and he kind of gave him some information, and we have that information surviving. Unfortunately, I don't know how complete the text is because it's not very big, but there's information nonetheless that we can glean away from there, okay, as it regards to alignment structure. Because most of you probably watching this can't read Korean, I want to state that there's actually 2 translations of it. So I did my best to kind of write something here that to the best of my abilities, converts this Hangul into English here, and they read a little differently. So let's read the first one here. Once the string is done being drawn behind full draw, the right elbow is gradually rotated towards the back. That is to say, like this way, towards your back, okay? And the left arm is gradually twisted inwards as the elbow and shoulders are lowered together and are kept level, and the handle is raised straight and pushed far, okay? Version 2, it reads a little bit more like even after the string is drawn fully and the bow is open. So this implies that whatever is about to be said has to be also done prior, but it's continuing to be done even after full draw, okay? So you can already see they read a little differently, right? The rear elbow rotates towards the back gradually, and the left forearm is gradually twisted in that the front elbow and front shoulder are not allowed to pop out, but rather are hidden by making them level and straightly pushes the handle. That's also a little weird. What does that mean? Well, based on all my years of coaching education from my coach, okay, like 15, 16, I guess actually 17 at this point, years or so, okay, and of all my years of 20 years plus of studying KTA, this is the conclusion that I've come to. I honestly think that the real meaning is something kind of halfway between the two. When it says that the right elbow is gradually rotated towards the back, what it's talking about is that most KTA archers, they'll take their draw side arm and their elbow, and then like as they pull, they'll pull it downwards this way. This exact text actually states not to do that and to rotate the draw side elbow behind this way. It's more of a horizontal motion, which in modern day Olympic recurve archery is sometimes referred to as an angular draw. So there's, for those of you who do, recurve archery, there's evidence to show that that technique was known in Korea prior to the modern day, which is kind of mind blowing, but there you go. The other thing and the little detail that we need to understand here is this part. And the left arm is gradually twisted inwards as the elbow and shoulders are lowered together and are kept level. This term level, okay, in Korean it's supyeong, okay? What this is referring to is things kind of being a straight line, okay? Not having any kind of sharp inclination like this. Now, of course, human beings are human beings, and I'm sure there's a little bit of leeway to have some angling there, but for the most part, it's referring to things being straight. There's a little bit further detail here, and the front shoulder are not allowed to pop out. What can that possibly mean? And that they're hidden by making them level. So let's talk about that from a military archery perspective. One of the things that I often say is that when you're trying to develop a military type archery interpretation, you really have to focus on this frontal angle. Because remember, in combat, unlike target archery, there's stuff that comes back at you. Enemy arrows, enemy bolts, spears, darts, knives, rocks, depending on the time period, potentially even, bullets. Okay? And that has to absolutely be considered in terms of your interpretation. Now, let's think about this for a moment here, right? What does that have to do with anything? Well, when it says that the elbow and the shoulders, or the bow arm and the shoulders, left forearm, all this stuff, right? Basically, this entire bow arm structure is made level with the shoulders. I personally believe what it's saying is to make them into a straight line like this. A lot of people will say, oh, it's just talking about the bow arm, but it says specifically the shoulders as well. So I think at the very least, this text is talking about either alignment type number 1 or alignment type number 2. Okay? I'm going to default to number 1, and I'll explain that in a bit, why that's going to be the case in a little bit, but I want people to understand where I'm deriving this from. Now, here's the thing. Do you notice something here? When you're in this kind of position, your bow arm side shoulder does look like it's popping out of the line between your body and your bow hand, right? Right here it says the front shoulder and front shoulder are not allowed to pop out. The front elbow and the front shoulder. This is clearly popping out. This creates a bit of a problem here, guys. Because do you see how much, just look at this. If you are an enemy archer or an enemy crossbowman, just look at this position. This is like one of the most common KTA positions that we see today. And I can see that it can work for target archery, but for military archery and for warbows, this is very dangerous because look, my armpit's exposed here, my draw hand's exposed here, my face is exposed here. This is just kind of an open invitation for the enemy, kind of ranged units to attack me like all over the place. And even though I would be wearing armor, remember that armor does not make you invincible, okay? All armor has weak points, especially this elbow right here, because not just the elbow, the armpit. The armpit is one of the most notorious places in armor just cross-culturally to try to protect, because it's a part of your body that requires a lot of range of motion because it's the shoulder, and it makes it quite delicate. But at the same time, if you armor it too much and you restrict this motion here, you will not be able to perform at your best, and will actually increase the chances of you basically getting hurt on the battlefield because you can't move your arms. So this makes you a gigantic target. However, if we make a straight line from the back shoulder to the front bow hand, not only does this allow you to brace with your entire body against the force of the bow, but it creates sufficient room back here where, unlike this, where the draw side shoulder joint has run out of range of movement, there's plenty of movement back here so that you can get the arrow, basically the draw arm behind your head, behind your torso, so that from the front, this is a very small target in comparison to this. Notice how much slimmer this target is. And while it isn't much, it's still something, like in the sense that, look at the bow here. It's covering my armpit, my elbow. And as it says right here, the front elbow and the front shoulder are now hidden from the enemy's perspective because they're actually in a straight line from the torso. You see what I'm saying here, guys? This becomes a much smaller target in comparison to all of this because we're not allowing it to pop out like we are here. So why is this significant? Because anyone who studied Korean traditional archery knows that the main manuscript that everybody studies is Chosun의 궁술. Now, I have a little bit of a different interpretation to Chosun의 궁술 as well, but in the introduction to that text, it specifically mentions that there's a different technique for shooting the military iron arrow, for shooting the target arrow, and for shooting the baby arrow, the pyeonjeon, the little thing that you shoot through the tube. Most KTA people that you talk to today, Myeonggung, Kudan, your average person will tell you that, yeah, there's a different technique for the military style and warbows versus the target archers. And, the military stuff's been lost. We don't know it anymore. Whatever. Like, we don't know. However, this text, 사해결에, the person who wrote this, okay, while it's not a complete manual, nevertheless, he was learning from Lee Chun-gi. And Lee Chun-gi, as I mentioned, was a real soldier and a really good archer at that. It is feasible that 사해결에 actually is talking about the native Korean military style. And details like this help to reinforce that. This idea of positioning yourself into like a wedge like this triangular wedge to give glancing surfaces so that if enemy projectiles come, again, you're wearing armor, right? So there's a higher chance that if it hits, it's going to glance off sideways. Look at my face. It's behind the bow. And while, it's not invincible, nevertheless, if I had a cheek plate right here, another cheek plate right here, it would make that opening for the face very, very small. Much harder of a target to hit, as opposed to this where my face is just kind of like, hey, right open to the enemy's projectiles, right? This kind of detail is not the kind of thing you would see unless we're talking about real military archery. So that's why I believe that for KTA, using alignment type number 1 or number 2 is the most appropriate for if you're trying to shoot Korean warbows. Okay? Now, I'm actually personally going to use alignment type number 1 in my interpretation. And the reason for that is this. When you're actually shooting, okay, like that, if you use alignment type number 2, because the draw elbow is like brought all the way back here, there's not a lot of room Okay, this is why it becomes quite difficult. So as a result of that, you will often see people kind of like, instead of having this compact release, they'll kind of extend their arm all the way out like that. It's called pyeoljol, which actually has connections to Chinese archery, by the way. um, but if you actually look at art time and time again, remember, art's not 100% reliable, but it's not 100% unreliable. You have to just know what you're looking at. Korean archers are often depicted with this kind of more compact release where the elbow, it's not pointing straight up at the sky, it's kind of slightly angled like this, okay? That's very, very important, because when you see just the art, people will go like, oh, what is that? Maybe it's just a mistake. What are they trying to show or whatever? But actually, if you study modern Olympic recurve archery like I do, the reason becomes really, really clear what is trying to be achieved here. And that is, what's happening is they're trying to maintain alignment. What do I mean by that, right? Well, a lot of people, even if you use alignment type number 1 or number 2, they can hit the alignment. But what ends up happening inevitably is, if you don't do it correctly, at the moment of release, archers cannot maintain alignment. Okay? See this? See that? The triangular alignment, triangular alignment, triangular alignment. Notice at the moment of release, in all cases, the alignment structure is maintained. Maintained. This is what we're talking about, guys. Getting into alignment is only half the battle. If at the moment of release you either pluck or you forward loose, you're breaking the alignment on this side, basically on this side. On this side right here. Okay, like this line. If this bow arm shoulder, collapses backwards, if the bow arm collapses inwards or downwards or whatever, you are breaking this line. Okay? At the moment of release and follow through, you have to be able to maintain this. Okay? And this posture, this structure, okay, this kind of line, right? This is one of the best ways to do that. And if you use alignment type number 1, it's very, very easy to do this. Because what you're essentially doing is you're forming this line, and at the moment of release, the draw side scapula moves in more, the arm swings around, and then you see that this draw side elbow now becomes part of this alignment structure. So what happens, and we'll get into this more a little bit, in the future, the draw side and the arm swinging in helps to brace the body further from getting pushed back, and instead basically further converts, as we talked about during that transfer, further converts this pulling force into a pushing force. Okay? I also want to mention something about the follow through here. Notice how the wrist is dropped down. Notice how the wrist right here, it's not like crooked this way, but it's like dropped down. You see that in the art right here. It's like it's dropped down. This is something important that we will talk about in the future about Korean 고자체기 or katra and the follow through motion that proceeds afterwards. But just understand this, guys, that if you can achieve this position, it will help you to stay stable through the release and follow through. And the easiest way to do it, again, is through alignment type 1, which is why, not the only reason, but one of the major reasons why I'm going to use this as part of my military Korean archery interpretation. In fact, it has stood the test of time. You see, this triangular alignment structure, I'd probably have to make a video about this at some point, but the history of Korean archery is very strange, because while it's true that Korean Olympic archers did at first learn a little bit, for those of you who don't know, Korean art, basically Western style archery was introduced in Korea. It kind of depends on who you ask, but basically there was this transition between the 1960s and 70s, okay? And this alignment type, this structure, okay, if you go back and look at old, footages of Western archers, so like American and European archers shooting, they were not using the triangle. I mean, nowadays they are, but they weren't back then. Like during this time period, the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, even during the 1990s and the early 2000s, they were not. A lot of those archers are shooting very, very crookedly. And this alignment type, as you can see, this is from Shilla. Okay, this is like basically late Shilla. And if you just look at the artwork, do you see that triangle? This is what I talked about. Like, if you look at artwork, if you don't know what you're looking at, it's often hard to say, anything definitively. But when you compare it against all of this, you start to realize what we're seeing is that triangular alignment system. I also specifically picked these two images because do you actually notice something here? That the string is touching the nose, the hand is anchored either at the side or beneath the jawline with the arrow going under the chin, just like the modern recurve archer. Yeah, that's a thing, by the way, and we'll get into that when I talk about Korean anchor types in the future. But I just want to point that out. But anyways, what I'm trying to show here is that the transition from historical archery to kind of pre-modern archery before the advent of the Western bow, right? You see that triangle here. This did not come from Western archers. This is before the introduction of Western archery. And here is an image of a Korean archer shooting with a Western bow. So this is like one of those old school one-piece wooden recurves, but he's trying it out. So he's a right-handed archer, but because he's shooting off the thumb side, he's using a left-handed bow. And then, you have ladies here shooting Western-style bows using 3 fingers, hooking underneath the jaw and all that stuff, forming that triangle. This is Kim Jin-ho, who was the bronze medalist at the 1984 Olympics, and she was kind of the first superstar that emerged from the modern day Korean Olympic archery, right? Everybody knows that in the Olympic archery world, the South Koreans are the top dogs. They're the big ones. They're basically the model that everybody follows now. And Kim Jin-ho was one of the first, if not the first, to start that trend. And you notice, even back then, 1984, she has that triangle. This is Ki Bo-bae, 2012 Olympic gold medalist. You can see the triangle. Chun In-young, 2024 Olympic team gold medalist, the triangle. And not just these three, like every single Korean archer who is a top-level Korean archer, you're going to see the triangle, okay? This type 1 alignment has stood the test of time, which is why I'm using it in my interpretation, because I have found with the proper training, it totally does work for warbows. I am a warbow archer. I shoot high poundages that are above 80, 90 pounds. Like I'm getting to that point now where I can shoot 100 pounds as well. And this is holding up beautifully, okay? So let's examine it a little bit further, okay? One thing that I mention a lot to people, and it doesn't always click for them immediately, but is that alignment and back tension are actually the same thing. I had a friend who asked me, how do you tell? Because I looked at a photo, because it was them from the side, and I was like, oh, I know what your alignment type is. And they were actually shooting with like a trapezoid shape. And since then, they've shifted to like a diamond shape because they're not shooting KTA. They're shooting a different style. But this friend asked me, like, how do you just know? And I told him, like, if you study this, it becomes really, really easy. And the thing you have to understand is this: alignment and back tension are the same thing. How come? Because they deal with the same anatomical structures. Remember that the scapula is called the shoulder blade. Remember that the shoulder joint is called the rotator cuff. Shoulder joint, shoulder blade, they're part of the same unit. I've heard people, and this isn't just one person, okay? I'm not singling anybody out here. Like, over the years, I've heard quite a lot of people say something to the effect that, oh, the shoulder blade is just this bone that floats around on your back or whatever, right? I'm like, no, that's not how the anatomy works, okay? You can go look this up. The shoulder blade, okay, connects to the muscles in the torso. And there's this thing called the acromion that kind of follows this ridge and goes up and connects right here at this joint into the collarbone. The collarbone goes down and connects into the sternum, and the sternum is part of the rib cage. The maximum range of motion, and I'll show this with a little bit more detail later, but the maximum range of motion of this collarbone is the maximum range of motion of the shoulder blade. The bow arm, okay, and the draw arm connect into the shoulder joint, but notice how there's actually two joints. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth later, but there's a joint Above, right here at the acromion, and there's another joint down here. So there's actually two joints of the shoulder. A lot of people learn this in biology class when they're back in middle school and high school and whatever, but sometimes we forget about that as archers, right? People always focus on this rotator cuff but forget there's another joint up here, because the positioning of these two joints relative to each other plays a huge part in how you're able to achieve proper alignment. What this basically means is this: if you look at the archer, the shape that they're forming from the side is exactly the shape they're forming from the top. To my friend who asked me that question, that's how I know. If I don't have an aerial view, I just look at them from the back and I look at the profile shape that they're making. Because if you make a triangle like this from the side, you will also be a triangle from the top. When you understand this concept that the alignment and back tension are the same thing, because they both deal with the shoulders, because the alignment has to go through the shoulder joints into the bone joints, like right here, and how those interconnect into the collarbones, you will start to understand why, everything has to be a certain way if you want to shoot with this system. And again, not everybody shoots with this system, that's fine. But if you want to shoot with this system, I'm going to back up here real quick. Notice something here. People are going to say, well, isn't this shoulder blade supposed to be here, right? Because you got to squeeze your shoulder blades together. Not if you're trying to achieve alignment type number 1. If you want to achieve alignment type number 1, you actually have to be using what I'm terming as Korean asymmetric back tension, what we know as transfer to hold in the modern Olympic world today, especially if you study like the KSL shot cycle. If you position your body like this and do it correctly, you will not get pushed back. And as I mentioned earlier, this skeletal model does not allow me to expand the ribs out and in to show the breathing effect, but if you do have the proper amount of air in your lungs, this gapping right here gets filled up because the rib cage expands and helps to brace the entire structure and fill that gap, these two gaps up. When we talk about expansion through breathing and about expanding the chest in the system that I'm studying, we're not talking about bringing the shoulder blades together this way and the chest expanding out in this direction. We're talking about the rib cage expanding in this direction and this direction, like sideways, because of your breathing. And again, something we'll get into in the future when we talk about expansion. But suffice it to say, and I'll show you guys in just a bit why this is the case, in order to hit alignment type number 1 properly, you need to be using Korean asymmetric back tension. Let's examine that.